So this is the first video that I've done in a while now. I'm going to try and get back on top of them a bit more regularly, just had a lot going on. And today I'm going to go over a few questions. Do I use HRV as a monitoring tool? Testing strength is building strength. What does this mean and is it relevant? And how to retain strength when dieting down a weight class, which I have discussed a little bit before, but I've had good success with this both personally and with my coaching, and it gets asked quite regularly, so I'll just go over some points again. To start with HRV. So HRV is really common now. For those who are unaware, it's heart rate variability, which isn't the same as heart rate. So heart rate is going to measure your average beats per minute. So 60 beats per minute doesn't mean that your heart's beating on the second every second for a minute. There's differences between the length of time between heartbeats, and it's measured by the R phase to R phase. And that's what heart rate variability is. So it measures your heartbeat at 0.8 seconds, and then the next beat was 1.2 seconds later, then the next beat was 0.7 seconds, then it was 1.3 seconds later, etc. And that difference between each heartbeat is your heart rate variability. A high heart rate variability is basically considered good, and low HRV is considered bad. That's the black and white kind of answer to it that people give. Now, I haven't got a hard stance on this. I'm open to using HRV in the future, and I may well do. For now, I don't use it on myself or clients. And I'll go over the reasoning for this, but there's some issues with HRV. It's not black and white. So when we say having a higher HRV is good, that the reason for that is because you've got it's a measure of your autonomic nervous system. So your parasympathetic and sympathetic. Sympathetic branch is your fight or flight, and your parasympathetic branch is your rest and digest. So when you get a signal from the parasympathetic branch, it's going to tell you slow heart rate down, and the sympathetic side is going to say speed heart rate up. So if you're getting a high level of variability, it means that you're kind of responding to both the parasympathetic, slow it down, the sympathetic, speed it up. If it's very close, then you're responding mainly to one pathway. So if your heart rate's at there's very little variability between beats, one of those sides is dominant. It tends to be the sympathetic system when we're talking about kind of strength training, but it is possible to have parasympathetic dominance as well. And the signs that you're not in a state of readiness. So you want that higher HRV. That's how it's kind of considered. But there are problems with this because there are instances where they've studied it and athletes' HRV has increased when they're doing a overreaching block and they're highly fatigued and the performance is actually going down. So it isn't necessarily a black and white, right, HRV is high, that means I'm ready to perform. It's been shown that is not the case. And with a low HRV, so if you're, say, they did a study on sprinters, it was swimming, and they found the HRV dropped, it was lower on the day of the competition when they hit PB. And that's just because there's not just your training that can impact your HRV. If you're a bit more anxious, you're a bit more excited, you've got a bit more adrenaline flowing, that sympathetic system, you're going to have lower HRV. Now, on the whole, I kind of get it. I get the reason for tracking it, because if you're in a chronic state of low HRV, you're perhaps not in the best state to recover. And that makes sense. But the question I ask myself is, if I was to have the information, say a client said, right, my HRV, this is my data for this week, or this is my data for the month, and we look over it, does that provide me with a tool that's going to impact the way that I program for them? And at the moment, the way I've considered it, probably not. Because say, right, my HRV's dropped. So, right, let's dig into it then. Why has it dropped? It could be down to all different factors. Are you more stressed? Have you been sleeping as much? Is your training volume, as have we put it up, is the intensity higher? How's your nutrition? So there's all these different things that are going to impact HRV. Now, we'll discuss those things anyway. So I'm quite, when I talk with clients, I often ask for the feedback regularly of how they're feeling, how the stress is, how the sleep is. And that already gives me a good idea of how how to program the sessions. If someone says, look, I'm really stressed at work, I'm not sleeping much, I've just had a newborn baby, it'd be kind of case of, right, well, we're not going to ramp volume right up in your training. We're probably going to use this phase, just lower the volume a little bit. We might try and just maintain kind of where you're at, or we might focus on something a bit different, might try and edge strength up, but we probably aren't going to think, right, we're going to go into a really high volume, high stress period of training. And we don't need HRV to tell me that. So it's kind of, is it a worthwhile tool? Now, if that was the only consideration, then I probably would use it. But what puts me off using it? So that having the HRV as a tool would be, it wouldn't be not useful. It would kind of add a bit more to what I'm receiving anyway as far as information goes. But what puts me off the most is a possible nocebo effect, where you wake up in the morning, you've got a big squat session, you look at your phone, it says HRV's low, you're not ready. What do you do? That can be enough to think, do you know what, I've got to put the brakes on, I've got to take an easier session today because my HRV's low. And then if I was to say, well, no, you need to push that session out, you need to hit that, you've got a comp in this amount of time, you need to push through. In the back of their mind, they're going to be worried that, shit, my HRV's low. I don't feel that bad, but I know I am. My body's basically telling me that I'm not ready for this. When, if you're in a period of high stress training, you'd kind of expect that low HRV anyway as you're going up to a comp before you taper. But it's enough, I think, to potentially get in someone's head and affect their session. And if you're programming, so the way I program, I'll give target numbers. So, right, I want you to work up to this weight, and then you do that many reps, that many sets. But it'll also have a guideline of reps in reserve as well, just to make sure that the reason I want someone at 190 for 2 on the squats is because I want them at about 1 rep in reserve, and I want that adaptation from that. So I'll know if warm-ups feel off, go work up to between, say, 187 and 200, and I'll put 195 as the kind of guideline figure. Then people can just base it off how they feel on the way up, which is essentially doing the same thing, meaning that they're going to be at 1 rep in reserve where I wanted them. But rather than just say that, I think I don't like to give people just the 1 rep in reserve, because that's fucking hard work to know where you're at. For me personally, I'd really struggle with that if I was a client, because if I was squatting 280 kilo as a 1 rep max, a lot of the time, anything over 240 for a double would feel maybe like 1 rep in reserve, when really it's because I aren't really that amped up for that set, because I want to save myself for the top set. So I'd like to give pretty precise guidelines of where I want the numbers at. And there's also the consideration that sometimes you've just got to push through. Sometimes it's you've got to hit that 250 kilo deadlift today. You're this far out, and I want you at that just to build some resilience, to build some mental strength. I want you to know that you can go in and hit that deadlift when you feel a bit tired and you're not quite on it. Having HR, the body might feel a little bit beat up, but they can push through that. If the body feels beat up and the HRV's dropped right down, and on the phone it's telling them you're not ready, it's going to make it harder to do that. And I think it's important to be able to perform when it's not ideal circumstances. If you get to comp day and you've had a bad sleep and you're stressed out, you've still got to perform. You can't decide that you're going to postpone the comp by a week. So I think, to sum it up, HRV, I think, is a tool that I'd potentially use in the future, but right now I don't feel like it provided me with a great deal of information that's going to change how I program sessions for someone. Because like I said, we go over the stuff that's going to matter anyway. Testing strength versus building strength. So I understand this because I've heard it quite a lot before, and it's kind of how it will be is someone will say, right, you can't just work up to 1 rep max weight all the time because you're not building strength, you're just testing your strength. And I kind of understand it, but then it's on the face of it, it sounds like, well, yeah, that's obvious. But then when you dig into it a bit and look at why is it not building strength? Because it clearly is building strength. If you're a powerlifter, the most specific session you could do would be a 1 rep max squat, because that's what you're trying to improve. The problem is you can't just always go for a 1 rep max squat, because you're probably going to fatigue too quickly and not get enough overall work in your sessions, and you're going to have to deload too often probably. But there's a lot to be said for going up to heavy singles. That isn't just testing strength, that is building strength. You've got to think, for improving the neural adaptations, heavier weights for singles are going to do that better than anything else. So if you're working up to 95% for a single, yeah, it's fatiguing, but you're going to improve your intermuscular coordination. You're going to, even the muscle architecture, like you're potentially building more intramuscular connective tissue, and then you've got your tendon stiffness. There's a lot of adaptations that are going to occur from hitting a heavy single. It's not, I think it's definitely a mistake to think of it as going for a heavy 1 rep set is not building my strength, it's just testing it, because that's totally wrong in my opinion. And I think the reason people say it is simply because it's not enough reps to get a great hypertrophy response. When you look at it from that side, to build muscle, which is going to aid in building your strength, in my opinion, I know there are some people who would disagree with that, but I think it's pretty clear in my opinion that building muscle does build strength in the long term. And yeah, that's the reason why I imagine, like, I am 100% sure, I've never actually heard anyone explain why it's testing strength and not building it, but I imagine it's because the rep range is lower than optimal to build muscle mass. Now, don't get me wrong, there's going to be some level of stimulus, to hypertrophy stimulus from a 1 rep max lift. It's just not going to be as high as, say, doing 3, 4, 5 kind of reps, and not as high as probably 6 to 8 reps. But there's still, you're going to get a lot of beneficial adaptation. It's very specific, and there's a lot of, it's a good idea, in my opinion. I have my clients do it often, because at the end of the day, 1 rep max weights feel different to a set of 5. Mentally, it's different getting up for that 1 rep and seeing that weight on the bar. And physically, it's different as well. Your line's going to feel a little bit different. It's harder to hold position, and it's going to strengthen the muscles in the positions that need to be strengthened, and just ingrain technique. One of the problems on the flip side is, if you let technique break down, you're going to ingrain poor technique. So the balance would be to go up to a heavy single, but not tire yourself out too much to be able to get the work in the rest of the session, and not to let the technique get too poor. Now, it might break down a little bit, but that's fine. It's going to break down a little bit on heavyweights. It just doesn't want to be to the point where it's totally gone to shit. It wants to be somewhat good, ideally just below the point where technique does break down, so you're ingraining good technique. But as long as you're capable of then getting the work in the rest of the session, like, I'm happy for people, like the way I program, I'm happy to compromise a little bit of volume to get those heavy weights in, because in my opinion, it pushes maximal strength up more so than getting extra volume in with light weights. Everyone's different, everyone recovers differently. I can't push everyone to go for singles at 95% every week, because a lot of people just wouldn't recover from it. The goal is to do it as often as possible whilst allowing that recovery. So to sum that one up, I don't believe that there's such a thing necessarily as testing strength v building strength. I think if you're hitting heavy 1 rep max weights or heavy singles, that's going to build strength really well. It's just not going to build muscle as well. And you need to build more muscle, especially as an intermediate type lifter. You need that extra muscle mass. That's going to be the fastest way to gain strength. But as far as I can see, that's the only real difference. So it's certainly not a case of one's testing strength, one's building strength. And then retaining strength as you diet down a weight class. So the keys to this, I've currently got a couple of guys doing it at the moment and had really successful cycles, got comps coming up. And the keys to this are to do it slowly. And doing it slowly is more due to the impact on leverages it has. If you lose weight too fast, body weight, even if it's just fat mass, if you retain all your muscle but you lose weight fast, your leverages change too quickly, and it changes how the lift feels too much, too fast. So your strength starts to plummet, because your technically it becomes a lot harder. So if you drop slowly, you can gradually get used to the change in leverage. So you're doing your bench press and you can just tweak it as needed. It's going to feel a little bit different as you drop weight. But if you do it slow enough, you can make the necessary adjustments as you're losing weight to maintain, or even really add, try and improve technique as you're losing the weight. And that's going to help retain strength better. And then you want enough stimulus to retain muscle mass. If you can retain all of your muscle and just lose body fat, obviously there's going to be some level of intramuscular fat and fluid stores and glycogen that's going to be down, which is going to make the muscle a little bit less full, which will have an impact on internal leverage. But if you can retain all of your muscle mass, then you can't do any more than that really to retain all your strength. And if you do retain all your muscle mass, you are going to retain your strength. Keep intensity high. So I've wrote these down just to go through them. Keep intensity high. I'm a big proponent, especially dieting. So I'd be more inclined to go heavy singles dieting than I would be in a calorie surplus where you're gaining weight. If you're gaining weight and you're 85% of your max and you're hitting sets of 3 or 4, it's going to feel good. You're going to have a bit in the tank. And then what happens is you decide one week, right, I'm going to put the weight up. And it tends to feel really good. Whereas if you're dieting and you spend all your time at about 85%, then you put the weight up to 95%. It often feels like shit because I've been there, I've done it, and clients tend to feel like that as well. So I think keeping heavy weights in while you're dieting is important. And again, it's just getting used to the leverage and positioning on that maximal attempt. So we've got slow weight drops, enough stimulus to retain muscle, keep intensity on the high end as often as you can while you're recovering. And then if you need to add cardio in, I'd go more low intensity, steady state. So if you're trying to keep your strength up, then the low intensity, steady state training, you're going to use more fat as the fuel to power that exercise. Now, don't get that confused with me believing that is more beneficial for fat loss, because it isn't. It's just a calorie game. But you're gonna have to do it for longer because you're going to be burning less calories. But if you're using more fat for fuel and less glycogen, that means your glycogen stores are going to be more topped up for when you train, which is important because higher levels of glycogen are going to keep your muscle fuller. And that's important, I believe, because everything feels better when your muscles are fuller. When your muscles are flat and depleted of glycogen, even 1 rep max attempts, in my opinion, they feel off. Whether that's the internal leverages or maybe something else going on, I don't know. But yeah, I try and retain as much glycogen as I could between sessions, which means not burning it doing some high intensity interval training. That'd just be a bad idea as far as maintaining strength goes, in my opinion. And that's kind of leads me onto the diet side, where I'm more of a proponent generally of higher carb, lower fat, pretty high protein as well. But when I set the protein target, and then it's going to be a case of, right, enough fats to maintain health, and then as many carbs as you can get in, because we want to keep that muscle as full as possible. We want to keep that fluid in there and the glycogen in there. The glycogen is going to pull the fluid in, and that's going to just help with the internal leverage. It's going to help maintain strength. And then you've got the energy as well, because even though you might be powerlifting, to maintain that muscle mass, you're still going to be doing sets of 7, 8, 9, 10, even maybe more reps. And when you get to those reps, it's going to rely on glycolysis. You're going to be using glycogen mainly as the fuel for those sets. So if you don't have that fuel there, you're going to produce less energy. Less energy means you're not going to be able to lift as much weight, which means you're not going to retain as much muscle mass. So yeah, more of a proponent of high carb, low fat on the diet. And that's about it for today. So if you've got any questions, just let me know, and I'll try and get some more videos done soon. Thank you.